There is a clay tablet that you will almost certainly never be allowed to read in full. It does not sit behind glass in a public museum hall. It is not reproduced in school textbooks. And according to the small number of people who claim to have studied the complete text, that silence is not an accident. The tablet tells a story that, if it is true, quietly rewrites everything we believe about who we are and where our minds came from. It claims that one of the oldest gods in all of human memory, a being the people of ancient Sumer called Enki, did something the rest of his own kind considered unforgivable. He handed the human race the one thing it was never meant to possess: the ability to choose, free will. And the tablet says he did not give it away for free. He paid for it. Not with gold, not with armies, not with territory, but with something far more personal than any of those. For thousands of years, that story lay buried under the sand of southern Iraq, in the ruins of a city the Sumerians said was the first city ever built. Today we are going to walk through it slowly, the way it was meant to be read. The story of how this particular tablet surfaced is almost as strange as what it claims to contain. The cuneiform writing of Sumer was only deciphered in the 1800s, and even now, after more than a century of work, hundreds of thousands of clay tablets sit in storage around the world, cataloged but never fully read. There simply are not enough people alive who can read the language, which means that somewhere in those archives, the texts that say the most uncomfortable things can sit untouched for generations. The people who tell this story claim that is exactly what happened here. A tablet logged, shelved, and quietly left alone because the lines on it did not fit the version of the past everyone had already agreed upon. To understand what Enki gave up, you first have to understand the world he came from. The Sumerians did not describe their gods as glowing spirits floating in some faraway heaven. They described them as a people who came down from the sky, who ate and argued and grew tired, who built cities and dug canals and made laws. They called them the Anunnaki, a name that means, roughly, those who came down from above. And in the oldest versions of the story, these beings did not arrive to be worshipped. They arrived to work. And this is what makes the Sumerian account so hard to wave away. This was not a fringe legend scribbled by one strange writer. The Anunnaki sit in the oldest layer of recorded human writing. In the creation stories, the king lists, the temple hymns, these were the bedrock beliefs of the people who gave us the wheel, writing, and the first cities. To them, none of this was a footnote. It was the story of where they came from. The texts say the Anunnaki came to this planet for resources. They settled in the marshes where the Tigris and the Euphrates run down toward the sea, and they put themselves to brutal labor digging the rivers and the irrigation channels by hand. For a long time, the lower ranks of these beings carried that weight. And eventually, the texts say, they broke. The labor itself, in the old texts, is described in a way that is hard to forget. The lower gods, sometimes called the Agigi, dug for what the tablets count as thousands of years. They hollowed out the riverbeds. They piled up the mountains of earth. And the strain of it broke something in them. They burned their tools in the night. They marched to the gate of Enlil's house and shouted that the work was killing them. For the first time, the ones at the top of this order understood that their world only ran because someone underneath them was suffering to keep it running. The question was never whether the digging would continue. The question was who would be made to do it next. This is where Enki enters the story. Enki was not the king of these beings. That title belonged to a harsher figure named Enlil, a god of storms and command, the one who gave the orders. Enki was something different. He was the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of craft and cleverness. While Enlil ruled through force, Enki solved problems through thought. And when the workers rebelled, it was Enki who offered the solution that would change history. If the lower gods would no longer carry the labor, he said, then they would create something new to carry it for them. A creature shaped from the clay of the earth, mixed with the essence of the gods themselves. A worker that could dig the canals, raise the crops, and serve without end. The Sumerians had a name for this creature. They called it the Lulu, which is often translated as the mixed one, or simply the first man. And here is the detail that most retellings skip past. According to the tablet at the center of our story, the first humans were not designed to think for themselves. They were built deliberately limited, obedient, capable of following instruction, capable of labor, but missing something on the inside. The capacity to question, the capacity to refuse. To Enlil, that was not a flaw. That was the entire point. Now, to see why free will was forbidden, you have to understand how the Anunnaki believed their world held together. The Sumerians described a set of cosmic principles they called the Me. Think of them as the operating rules of reality, the decrees that governed everything from kingship to farming to the rise and fall of cities. The Me were guarded jealously. They were the source of all order. And the gods believed that if the wrong powers ever fell into the wrong hands, the entire structure of their world could come apart. There is a reason the gods treated the Me as something close to sacred. In the Sumerian mind, order was fragile. Civilization, kingship, the rituals, the boundaries between gods and mortals, all of it rested on everyone staying inside their assigned place. A human who could choose was a human who could step outside that place. And once one being stepped out, the whole carefully balanced structure was at risk. To Enlil, free will was not a kindness he was withholding out of cruelty. It was a door he refused to open, because he was certain that what waited on the other side was chaos. Free will, in this system, was one of the most dangerous powers of all. A being that could choose could also disobey. A being that could question could also rebel. The Anunnaki had only just survived one uprising from their own lower ranks. The last thing Enlil wanted was to hand that same fire to a race of millions of newly made workers. So when the humans were created, they were created on purpose without it. They would serve, and they would never think to ask why. For a time, it worked exactly as Enlil intended. The texts describe humanity multiplying across the plains over time, raising the temples, feeding the gods, doing the labor the Anunnaki no longer wished to do themselves. From above, it must have looked like a perfect arrangement. A self-replacing workforce that never complained, never struck, never set down its tools in the dark. But Enki saw something the others did not. He was, after all, the one who had shaped these creatures. The texts repeatedly cast him as the craftsman, the one who knelt in the clay, the one who knew the work intimately. And the more he watched the beings he had made, the more something began to trouble him. They suffered, they labored under the sun, and they died without ever understanding anything beyond the task in front of them. They were, in the most literal sense, tools that could feel. And Enki did not shape them alone. The texts name a goddess at his side, sometimes called Ninhursag, sometimes Ninmah, a mother figure who helped mix the clay and pull the first beings into form. Together they read almost like engineers, testing their designs, making mistakes, producing flawed early versions before they settled on the model that finally worked. That detail matters. It tells us the humans were not a careless afterthought. They were a project, something refined over many attempts, and a project that careful is not one you abandon easily once you start to see it suffer. There is something almost modern about the dilemma the tablet lays out. A maker, standing over the thing he has built, realizing it has become aware enough to suffer, and forced to decide whether awareness like that deserves more than the cage it was born into. The Sumerians had no single word for what we would call consciousness, but the tablet circles the idea again and again, describing the humans as beings who could feel the full weight of their lives without ever being given the means to change them. Enki, more than any other god, could not stop seeing it. It is the oldest version of a question we have still not fully answered. Some of the older translators describe this as the turning point in Enki's character. He had built the Lulu to solve a problem. But somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing a solution and started seeing a people trapped inside a design that was never meant to let them grow. And this is where the Forbidden Tablet becomes specific in a way that the public versions of the myth never are. According to those who claim to have read it, the tablet does not simply say that Enki felt sympathy. It records a confrontation. A meeting of the high gods in which Enki stood before the council and argued that the humans should be given more, not more food, not more rest. The spark. The inner fire that would let them choose, reason, and decide for themselves. The tablet, the translators say, records the back and forth of that council in unusual detail. Enki is said to have made an argument that none of the other gods expected. He told them that a servant who obeys only because it cannot do otherwise is not loyal. It is simply trapped. Real devotion, he argued, could only come from a being that was free to walk away and chose to stay instead. The gods, he warned, were building a kingdom on the backs of creatures who felt nothing for them, and a kingdom like that would always be hollow. It was a strange thing for a god to say, and it did not move a single one of them. The council, the tablet says, refused him. And the reason they gave is chilling in how simple it is. If you give them the power to choose, they warned, they will eventually choose against us. They will look up at the ones who made them, and they will decide they no longer wish to serve. The very thing that makes them useful, their obedience, would be the first thing to die. Enlil is said to have been the loudest voice against it. To him, the matter was not even complicated. The humans were property, livestock with hands. You do not teach your cattle to think, because a thinking herd is a herd you will lose. He ordered the idea buried. The question was closed. The Lulu would remain as they were made, blind and obedient, forever. This is the section the people who study the tablet point to by its passage markings, the part they insist was left out of the public translations. It does not read like worship. It reads almost like a transcript, a record of a decision being made, with names attached, and a vote that went against the one God who saw further than the rest. If you have ever felt that the friendly, helpful version of Enki in the school books seems slightly incomplete, this may be why. The full picture was never the one we were handed. The tablet describes a long silence after that council. A stretch of time where, on the surface, Enki obeyed. He returned to his temple in the city of Eridu, the first city, the place the Sumerians said civilization itself began. He said nothing more about the matter. To the other gods, it must have seemed that the wisest among them had finally accepted the ruling. He had not accepted anything. In that quiet, the texts say, he began to prepare. He could not give the gift in the open, not after a direct ruling from the council. Whatever he was going to do would have to be done in a way the others could not stop, and could not undo once it was finished. He understood the law of his own people well enough to know that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. And the line he was about to cross would cost him everything. The tablet describes the gods as connected to one another, and to their decrees, through something the Sumerians treated almost like a living essence. Call it a divine inheritance, a shared spark that marked a being as one of the high gods, granting it a place inside the order of the me. It was the thing that made Enki a god, rather than a creature. And according to the forbidden text, it was not something he could simply copy and hand out like bread. The old texts hint that this essence was tied to blood, or to something the gods carried in its place. In one of the better-known creation accounts, the humans are made from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain god, a being sacrificed so that his life could pass into the new creatures. The forbidden tablet, the translators say, takes that idea further. It is not enough, in this version, for a god to simply die and be stirred into the mix. The fire of free will had to be given knowingly, by a living God, in full understanding of what it would cost him. A sacrifice only counts if the one making it knows exactly what he is losing. If the humans were going to receive that fire, it had to come from somewhere real. It had to be taken from a being who already carried it, and the only being willing to give it was Enki himself. This is the sacrifice the tablet describes. Not a dramatic death on a battlefield, something quieter and in a way far heavier. Enki is said to have taken a portion of his own essence, the very thing that tied him to the council of the high gods, and poured it into his creation. He divided what made him whole. He gave a piece of his own divinity to beings that the rest of his kind saw as livestock. And Enki knew exactly what he was doing. That is what makes the moment land. He did not stumble into this. He weighed his own standing among the gods, his wholeness, his place in the order that had defined his entire existence, against the suffering of creatures the rest of his kind would not even look at, and he decided the creatures were worth more. When he poured part of himself into the human race, he was not performing a ritual. He was choosing to become less so that we could become more. There is a second tradition that the people who study this tablet always bring up, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. In a much later story, told far to the west, there is a garden and a tree, and a being who offers the first humans a forbidden knowledge that the highest God did not want them to have. A, being often drawn as a serpent. And in the older Sumerian imagery, Enki is repeatedly tied to the serpent, to the symbol of two snakes coiled around a staff, to the bringer of hidden knowledge to mankind. The parallel is not proof of anything, but it is the kind of echo that is very hard to wave away as coincidence. The same shape of story, the same forbidden gift, the same furious god above, surfacing thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. If that connection holds, then the figure later cultures painted as the great deceiver may have started out as something closer to the opposite, a maker who loved his creations enough to defy the one in charge. A being who was punished not for lying to humanity, but for telling it the one truth it was never meant to know, that it could think for itself, that it was free. And the moment he did it, the tablet says, something in him was permanently diminished. The texts describe it in different ways. Some lines speak of Enki becoming lessened, of a light in him going dim. Others describe him being cut off, partly exiled from the inner circle of the gods, no longer fully trusted, no longer fully one of them. He had broken the highest law of his people. He had taken the sacred fire and given it to the clay. There was no undoing it. The humans now carried a piece of a god inside them, and Enki would walk the rest of his existence as a being who had given part of himself away and could never get it back. What he gained for us, though, was everything. The instant that spark entered the human race, the design changed. The blind obedience cracked. For the first time, the beings that had been built only to serve could look at the world and form their own thoughts about it. They could love something they were not told to love. They could refuse an order. They could imagine a life different from the one in front of them. The Sumerians, in their own strange way, were trying to describe the birth of the human mind as we know it. The change did not happen all at once across the whole species, the texts suggest. It spread, like a flame catching from one dry reed to the next. The first humans to carry the spark looked different to the gods almost immediately. They asked questions no worker had ever asked. They grieved. They wondered about the stars above them. They began to suspect that the beings they served were not all-powerful after all. And that suspicion, more than anything else, was what terrified Enlil. A servant who doubts his master has already stopped being a servant. And exactly as the council had feared, the humans began to change. They built. They questioned. They organized. They started to want things for themselves. The perfectly obedient workforce that Enlil had designed began, slowly, to slip out of his control. And when Enlil finally understood what had happened, when he realized that Enki had defied the council in secret and given the forbidden gift anyway, his response was not sorrow. It was rage. This is where the tablet connects to one of the most famous stories in all of human history. Enlil's first attempts to take back control, the older epics tell us, were smaller than what came later. A plague to thin the numbers, then a drought to starve them out. Each time, the texts say, Enki found a quiet way to help the humans survive, whispering to them how to endure, what to do, how to outlast the punishment. And each time the humans came back, more numerous and harder to ignore. Enlil's patience finally broke, because the texts say that Enlil, furious at what humanity had become, decided to erase the experiment entirely. Humanity had grown too loud, too numerous, too aware. So Enlil resolved to wipe them off the face of the earth with a great flood, a deluge that would drown the cities, swallow the plains, and return the world to silence. He bound the other gods to an oath. Not one of them was to warn the humans. They would be allowed to die without ever knowing the water was coming. And once again, Enki refused to obey. He could not break the oath openly. So, in the version preserved in the old texts, he did something clever. He went to the home of a single righteous man, a figure the Sumerians called Atrahasis and the later Babylonians called Utnapishtim, the same figure who would eventually echo down into the story of Noah. Enki did not speak to the man directly. Instead, the texts say, he spoke to the reed wall of the man's house, and he let the warning pass through the reeds. He told the wall to tear itself down and become a boat. He described the coming flood to an empty room, knowing the man on the other side was listening. The man built the boat exactly as the warning described. He sealed it, loaded it with his family and the seeds of life around him. And when the rains came and the rivers rose and the world went under, he floated on top of the water that swallowed everyone else. The texts say the gods themselves grew frightened by what they had unleashed. crouching like dogs against the wall of heaven, horrified at the scale of the death they had ordered. When it was over and the boat came to rest, the survivors stepped out into a drowned and silent world. It was a loophole. Enki kept the letter of his oath while shattering its purpose, and because of it, humanity survived the flood that was meant to end it. When the waters finally pulled back, the tablet says, the gods looked down at the handful of humans who had lived, and they understood that the experiment could not be undone. The fire was loose in the world. Enki had made sure of it. The price had already been paid, and the gift could not be taken back. So what happened to Enki after all of that? The texts grow quieter here, which is part of why the tablet at the center of this story matters so much to the people who claim to have read it. The mainstream myths celebrate Enki as a hero, the clever god, the friend of mankind. But they tend to fall silent on the cost. They rarely dwell on what it meant for a god to permanently divide his own essence and live on forever as something less than he once was. The forbidden tablet, according to those same translators, does not stay silent, it lingers on it. It describes Enki in his later existence as a being marked by what he had done, honored by the humans who never fully understood the source of their own minds, and quietly diminished among the gods who never forgave him for it. He had traded his standing, his wholeness, and his place in the order of his own kind for a race of creatures that would build temples to him, and then, in time, forget his name entirely. Why, then, do we not learn this version in school? Why does the helpful, clever Enki of the textbooks never seem to pay for anything? The people who champion this tablet have an answer, and it is the kind of answer that is impossible to fully prove and impossible to fully dismiss. They say the story of a god who sacrificed his own divinity to free his creations is not a comfortable story for anyone who wants the past to stay simple. It raises too many questions about where the human mind came from, about what was given and what was taken, about whether the oldest civilization on Earth was trying to tell us something we were not ready to hear. And maybe that is the part that lands the hardest. Because if there is any truth at all hidden inside this old story, then every choice you have ever made, every time you refused an order that felt wrong, every time you imagined a life different from the one you were handed, you were using something that, in the language of this tablet, was never supposed to be yours.